Fantastic. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world joining us for this session. This is the joint London Funders and Centre for Effective Philanthropy session, so bringing together lessons from across the UK and the US on funder support for Black and minoritized communities as part of our Festival of Learning 2022. I'm James, I'm Chief Executive of London Funders. We're the progressive movement of funders from across all sectors who invest funds to build a better London by taking actions on the issues that matter to our city and our communities, and I'm going to be chairing our discussion today. You're joining us as part of the Festival of Learning. It's all about bringing funders and civil society groups together to reflect, to share learning and insights, and try to make sure we're using our experiences and the work we've done together over recent years as a springboard for positive action in the funding community. We hope that we can hopefully capture some of the best of what we've done together, we can amplify that, and we can build that movement for positive and progressive change. This is one of over 40 sessions we've had across the fortnight. We've had hundreds of people join us from across our community. And we hope that this is one of those sessions that you leave feeling really reinvigorated, able to look to the future with that confidence and ambition that we know we need to face some of the challenges and to maximise the opportunities that are ahead of us. Some practical points for those of you joining us live before I introduce the fabulous people that you can see on the screen with me. We are recording this session and we're going to be making it available on the London Funders YouTube channel after the festival. So if there are colleagues of yours who wanted to be with us today but have gone to the parallel session or aren't able to join us today, you can share that link with them so we can try and get this learning spread as far and wide as we can. On the subject of spreading learning far and wide, we're also going to be live tweeting the discussion. So do make sure you're following us at London Funders and tweet yourself using the hashtag LondonLearnFest. And I think Milena will pop a link to that in the chat so you can make sure you're using the right hashtag. These are very important things these days. As you'll see, we're joining you in webinar format, which means you can see us, lucky you, but we can't see you. So if you've got a point or a question that you want the panel to reflect on, if you pop that in the Q&A box for us, you can use that as a space to express any points or raise any questions that you want our panel to consider, and we'll come to those later in the discussion in this session. You can also use the chat box that Milena has just posted the hashtag into, where you can share your own learning, your own reflections, any resources that you think would be helpful to you. And that's also where Milena will be dropping links to any reports or resources that are mentioned on today's session. And if you're watching this on the recording, do just drop us a line at London Funders. We can link you to any of those resources if you need. So you're with us for the next hour and a bit, where we'll have some thoughts and reflections from the panel. We'll have a conversation together, and we'll pick up any of the questions you pose for us in the Q&A box. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce our esteemed panel. You'll notice from the brochure that we are one person short, as sadly Yvonne from Ubeli is recovering from a bad dose of COVID, so she's resting up today. But my colleagues are going to be posting links in the chat to some of the resources and reflections that Yvonne sent through to us that she was planning to share, building on the Buteau papers and the learning we did together through the COVID response. So do take a look at those in her absence. But on your screen, you have three amazing people, starting with Ellie, who's Vice President for Research at the Centre for Effective Philanthropy. Ellie oversees the delivery and the writing of CEP's own research and manages their research team. And she's also authored or co-authored reports, articles, opinion pieces on foundation effectiveness. That's everything from responding to crisis to how major individual donors can best support non-profits. As well as speaking at national and international conferences, Ellie was also one of the 12 non-profit leaders selected nationally as a 2012 Independent Sector American Express Engine Fellow. So we're fantastic to have you with us today, Ellie. Alongside Ellie, we've got Sufina, who's Director of the John Ellerman Foundation here in the UK. You may have seen Sufina earlier in the week chairing the Excellent Leadership session as part of the festival, building on the research she undertook as part of her MBA at Warwick Business School. As well as her experience leading the John Ellerman Foundation, Sufina's previously worked for the National Lottery Community Fund and City Bridge Trust, and holds trustee roles with organisations including Just for Kids Law and the Charterhouse, and is also an honorary fellow of the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, having chaired their expert panel on equality, diversity and inclusion. So really looking forward to your perspectives as well, Sufina. And last but definitely not least, we have Marcella, who's the Vice President of Programmes and Partnerships for the Brooklyn Community Foundation, in which role they direct the strategic grant-making, partnerships and community leadership programmes. The Foundation centres racial justice and equity, amplifies the expertise of and shifts power and resources to the communities it seeks to serve and partner with. Before joining Brooklyn Community Foundation, Marcella's worked in senior leadership roles for Project Street Beat in New York City and worked in HIV prevention and access to care, as well as reproductive justice issues in NYC and nationally. Fantastic to have you with us, Marcella. So I'm sure you'll all agree, if you're watching, that this is an excellent panel. I'm delighted we've been able to make this work across the multiple time zones that people are currently sitting in, and I know it's going to be a great conversation today. In terms of the structure, I'm going to ask each panelist to share some reflections on our topic of funder support for Black and minoritized communities, both from the US and the UK perspectives, before we open up to conversation. So for the first part of that, we'll all be together, and then for the final 20 minutes of our session today, we'll bid a fond farewell to Sufina, and we'll just keep Marcella and Ellie with us for focusing in on the learning from the US experience, if that's okay. So as our panelists are about to speak, do keep your questions coming in on anything they're saying in the Q&A box, ready for the conversation that's to come. But to get things going, I'm going to hand over to you, I think probably in the reverse order to the way I just introduced you, for those opening remarks, if I can. So Marcella, I'll hand over to you first, and then we'll come to you, Sufina. So we've got the funder perspectives together, and then we'll invite Ellie to give views from the CEP perspective, if that's okay. So Marcella, your thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James, and thank you for having me. As James shared, my name is Marcella Tillett. I'm Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at Brooklyn Community Foundation here in Brooklyn, New York. We are the first and only public foundation solely dedicated to Brooklyn's charitable community. We work in partnership with generous donors and community leaders to invest in racial justice and community-led change. Since our founding in 2009, the foundation has provided over $75 million in grants to nonprofits through our community fund and our donor advised fund programs. And, you know, I'm going to be talking a lot about our commitment to racial justice. And we are very clear here at the foundation about the fact that we are working towards racial justice in a society founded on white supremacy and anti-Blackness. That is kind of at the forefront of our everyday work, and in all of our conversations, it is very present. People of color represent nearly 70% of all Brooklyn residents, yet there are significant racial disparities in the distribution of power, resources, and opportunities in our communities. We strongly believe addressing systemic racism and injustice is the first step to really fulfilling our mission of establishing a fair and just Brooklyn. Our commitment to racial justice was established following our 2014 community engagement project called Brooklyn Insights, which was a unique effort to hold a dialogue across neighborhoods about Brooklyn's future. We spoke to 1,000 residents and local leaders who shared their concerns about challenges in their communities and sectors, as well as opportunities they saw for positive change in a borough where nearly half of the residents are living in or near poverty. A major theme that emerged in the course of the project as a critical lever of change was addressing disparities and barriers across racial lines. We believe, as part of our commitment, that all people should be equally seen, heard, valued, and respected. Our goal is racial justice. We see that as the redistribution of power, opportunities, and access so that we have a society free of racial hierarchies. And we do that through our investments in community-based programs and community-led advocacy and social change, for social change. We really are aiming to increase the ability of Black, Indigenous, and all people of color to determine and sustain a fair and just future for themselves and their communities. That insights process that I just described is something that we did for the first time in 2014, but we have made a part of our ongoing practice. So we have these insights conversations. Every time we open a new fund, we have subject-specific insights conversations. We just held a series of those about 6 months ago on substance addiction and harm reduction to inform a new fund we launched at the top of the year. And this all kind of rolls up into our institution-wide racial justice lens. And we kind of position the following things at the core of that lens, which are understanding and naming root causes of racial inequities, acknowledging historical trauma stemming from systemic racism, supporting opportunities for healing and empowerment, ensuring that those directly affected by structural racism are centered in decision-making, and measuring and tracking outcomes in advancement of racial justice through philanthropy. So for our grant-making process, this looks like participatory grant-making across all of our community fund programs, where we have a shared decision-making framework where we share decision-making power with community members who have lived experiences on the issues we're addressing. So they join us in reviewing grant proposals, conducting site visits, and awarding grants. And again, that's a demonstration of our belief that people who are closest to the challenges are closest to the solutions. We move money and resources to Brooklyn nonprofits that are addressing racial justice issues in their communities. And we prioritize those organizations that are led by members of the communities, right? Folks that are not just bringing the voices in, but really the voices are in leadership and at the forefront of what those solutions look like. So last year, 87% of our grantee partners, our organizations, were led by people of color, and nearly half of them had annual budgets under $1 million. So these are small organizations that are being formed at the community level. They're coming through grassroots processes, and we come in as a partner to see how we can support those. Another way we've used this commitment to shape our grant making is by looking at some key indicators at the district level and different communities in our borough, and really understanding which indicators correlate to more severe outcomes in Black and Latinx communities. So we've identified 10 neighborhoods that we've determined to be facing the greatest systemic barriers to social health and economic equity. And we prioritize those communities and organizations serving those communities in our grant making and our support. As a good practice, we provide general operating support. We give organizations flexibility to use their funding where they determine it's most needed. And we strive to reduce administrative burdens on nonprofits with simplified grant applications and reporting processes. We also have something called an equity filter, which I'm happy to talk about later, that helps us to not just look at organizations that are led by people who've been marginalized within broader society, but specifically how that's been replicated in philanthropy. And we know that there are, Black and brown leaders who don't get the same trust as white leaders. They're not invested in at the same levels from philanthropic institutions. And so we prioritize them and really put them at the front of the line for not only our resources, but when we're making donor connections and when we're kind of creating those bridges to other foundations that are sharing resources. So I'll definitely share more in the Q&A, but this commitment to racial justice really runs deep, both in our internal and our external work. And again, it's all based on an understanding and a recognition of the white supremacist and anti-Black society we live in, and how that affects our work and really has to be present in how we think about our solutions and our approach.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marcella. That's a fantastic introduction to the incredible work that you're doing. And I'm really looking forward to delving into that in a bit more detail. I think some of those themes of the context, of structural racism and how we tackle that where we've started from is not a perfect place, but the topics you're expressing there about leadership, about participation, about led by and for, how do we build those movements and how we do that are really strong themes that I think, not preempting Sufina, but I imagine there might be elements of that in what she says, but certainly we're going to pick up in the conversation to come. So thank you for getting off to a fantastic start for us for this session. Sufina, what's it look like from the UK perspective for you?
Great, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here. So I'll offer some kind of brief reflections on how things are going here at John Ellerman Foundation. And as part of that process, I'll be also referencing some of the things that we're kind of involved in, which are more sector-wide rather than, initiatives that are solely ours. I'd say that compared to Marcella and the brilliant work that you're doing, we're much earlier on the journey. And so I'll speak to that briefly. But first of all, my name is Sufina, really pleased to be here. I work for John Ellerman Foundation. We are a UK-based grant maker and we make grants in arts, social action and environment. And so I think the thing that I would reflect on is our starting point. As an organisation, we are very focused on how we can be transparent, accountable and effective. And for us, that is not just about our grant making, it is also about how we invest, and it's about our operations, and it's about our kind of history, our through line. Who were we and who are we now and who will we be is very much a kind of sense of what we're working on and how we're trying to frame a lot of the thinking that we're doing within the foundation. And so where does diversity, equity and inclusion, where does justice, where does racial justice, where do all of those types of things come into our conversations when you think of that kind of framing that I've just set out? So I think in some ways we have perhaps, hidden isn't the right word, we've been used to kind of saying, well, we're generalist, we're a responsive funder, we're led by what people say and share. And so, you know, what is our role in this? We're not a justice-based funder, we're not a, you know, insert ABC kind of specific marginalized group or intersecting marginalized groups. And the reality is that that doesn't mean that we don't care about all of the issues that pertain to diversity, equity and inclusion, but it is less proactive than we need to be. And so I think we have absolutely moved into a more proactive space on diversity, equity and inclusion, as opposed to a reactive space, which is possibly where many of us have been at different times. And sometimes, you know, we oscillate between proactivity and being reactive, but I think we are more consistently in that proactive space. And the way that we're kind of trying to operate is to ultimately start dialogues around what does diversity, equity and inclusion mean in relation to our grant making, in relation to our operations. So that could be hiring, who we use as suppliers, you know, in relation to the way in which we invest, and so on and so forth. And I think because we've taken this much kind of broader picture to start us off with, it's meant that the dialogues are, sometimes they go at pace and other times we are kind of inching along, making progress. And I always say, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back is at least still 1 step forward. But there are moments where even I need to remind myself of that, because it can feel quite laborious, but it's necessary. I think, you know, we could easily just take something, we could take toolkits, we could take information that other people are doing and try to kind of adopt them in our organisation. But unless we really do the dialogue, do the deep work, then the toolkits and so on and so forth, they're very kind of surface level, and we're trying to do something that kind of penetrates more deeply. So there's that element. One thing that we have been doing is we were very fortunate to be able to contribute to the Resourcing Racial Justice Funder collaboration. And as part of that, we've been able to get some coaching and learning support, and we've been on a real kind of impact-oriented journey. And that process has allowed us to think much more deeply about some of the issues that occur, not just in our social action grant making, but our arts grant making and our environmental grant making. So I think it's broadening the conversations out. And through Resourcing Racial Justice, we were also asked to develop an accountability plan. And this isn't about being accountable to just anyone, it's about being accountable to ourselves and really being very visibly accountable to each other, because inevitably within the organisation, people are at different points in the journey and they're working at different speeds. And so this element of the accountability plan has been a real kind of uniting feature of our work, because it shows organisationally this is where we are and how we're moving and the pace we're moving at, and it provides that kind of momentum. And because it has that kind of external scrutiny, which is provided by our peer funders, and Resourcing Racial Justice as the kind of body that encouraged us to create that plan, it just keeps that further level of accountability too. And then there are other initiatives that we've been working on, and that includes the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Data Standard. And, you know, I think that's something that a lot of us as funders lack, and it's like really solid, definitive baselines. So we all kind of want to go, oh, we must do more, but we don't know what our starting point is. And then we don't know what our kind of comparative benchmarks are. And so inevitably we get back to this kind of point I was making earlier about things being surface level. So it's like, yeah, I'm going to go and you know, fund more BME-led organisations. But if you don't know what your starting point is, if you don't know if you've got kind of innate biases that are built into your processes, whereby people are applying to you from which are, you know, Black and minoritized ethnic led groups, but you're rejecting them, but you're just saying, oh, you know, I'm going to go out and go speak to a load of groups and try and build a pipeline. It's kind of like a road to nowhere. So just to kind of summarize, because I did say I'd do kind of brief reflections, I think we're kind of very focused on the starting point for us is about how do we be a transparent, accountable and effective grant maker. That is about our endowment and how it's invested, our grant making and who we invest in and how we work with them, our operations in terms of things like who we partner with as our suppliers, but also how we recruit, retain and progress staff and so on and so forth. And that's also at a governance level, of course, it's not just staff. And then who were we, who are we, and who will we be in the future? And on the who were we, I know James will talk about this later, but I think that organisations must consider their origins and the way in which that permeates and penetrates your culture decades, centuries later. So that's kind of the approach in a nutshell. We're a small organisation, there's 6 of us in total. We cannot do this alone, which is why we partner with people like Resourcing Racial Justice, but also get involved in initiatives like the DEI data standard. And through that, across all of those 4 areas, the real focus as well is really understanding through deep dialogue, what is our baseline and where do we move up to in terms of benchmarks and targets. So yeah, that's a few reflections, but really delighted to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
So thank you so much, Sufina. I think really important to contextualize that, both in some things that are similar to what Marcella was saying there in terms of their sort of historical context and where that journey has started from, but also looking at what the opportunities are for us to think about this in a much bigger context than the grant making aspect, you know, about all the things you do in the round as an organisation and the part you play in society and how that can start to shift things. And for me, really important points there about accountability. I think sometimes it can be very difficult to feel accountable as a funder or the people with the money and the power often, but opening yourselves up to that scrutiny and putting yourselves out there in that transparent way to be accountable is a really powerful part of that process. So thank you for sharing that with us. Ellie, as a sort of fellow umbrella coordinating, supporting, enabling organisation, how are things looking from the US side for you?
Well, thank you, James, and thanks for having me here today. I just wanted to share a little bit about the Center for Effective Philanthropy because we are a US-based organization, although for the past several years, we've also had a staff member based out of Amsterdam and are currently looking to hire another individual to be based in Europe. We do work with a number of foundations outside the US. But our mission at the Center for Effective Philanthropy is to provide data, feedback, programs, insights to help individual and institutional donors improve their effectiveness. So we do this work because we believe that effective donors working collaboratively and thoughtfully can profoundly contribute to creating a better and more just world. So we conduct research, and that's mainly what I'll be sharing with you today. We host a blog, we host conferences, and we offer assessments to individual foundations, such as the Grantee Perception Report, which is a semi-standardized tool for foundations that wish to understand what grantees' experiences with them are like. And some of the data that I'll share with you today actually comes from a decade's worth of data from our Grantee Perception Report. We've conducted research on diversity and race for a number of years, but today I wanted to share findings from some of our most recent research over these past couple of years. So to jump straight to that, one of the key findings from our research last year was that even as foundation leaders in the US acknowledge that they have much yet to do, many say that racial equity has been a more explicit consideration in how they conduct their work, and many say that they're modifying their practices as a result. So this is data that we collected in 2021. And with the pandemic, many foundations in the US also signed what was called a pledge that was started by the Ford Foundation and supported by Trust-Based Philanthropy, hosted by an organization called the Council on Foundations, in which they were agreeing to, for example, provide more unrestricted support to nonprofits during the pandemic, to focus on communities that were being most impacted by the pandemic. And in the United States, right, the pandemic was happening at the same time that there were louder and louder demands for racial justice in the United States, especially around the murder of George Floyd. So there were a number of forces in the United States that were kind of acting on foundations and having them really reconsider practices, what they were doing and how they were doing it. So some of the data that we collected in 2021, I can tell you that self-reported foundations in our research, 41% of them said that they had increased the percentage of grant dollars to organizations serving Black communities. And of course, this is self-reported data, and self-reported data has its own drawbacks. But 41% of foundations in our survey said increasing percentage of grant dollars to organizations serving Black communities. 26% said they had increased the percentage of grant dollars to organizations serving Latino communities. And about half of the foundations said they are currently directing at least a moderate percentage of grant dollars. That was about 25% or more of their grant dollars to organizations serving Black or Latino communities. Fewer foundations, though, said that they were increasing the percentage of grant dollars to other communities affected by systemic inequities. For example, Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And the other community that really stood out in our research was Native American communities, which I will elaborate on today because that's much more US focused. Those that did say they were increasing percentage of grant dollars going to Asian American and Pacific Islander communities said that that's currently a small percentage of their grant dollars. And in fact, across a few different data sets, ones that we collected directly from foundations in the past couple of years, as well as the grantee perception report data that we have for well over a decade, we noticed some concerning trends for Asian American and Pacific Islander leaders and organizations that serve those communities. Trends that we don't see for nonprofit leaders in communities of other races and ethnicities. So I'll share briefly here and then can elaborate later. But one of the findings from that research was that Asian American and Pacific Islander nonprofit leaders reported having less positive experiences with their foundation funders than nonprofit leaders of other races and ethnicities. This was the case during the pandemic, as well as in a decade's worth of data that we had prior to it. They rate their foundation's understanding of their organizations and the context in which they work lower than executive directors of other races and ethnicities, as well as the strength of their relationships with their funders. I can elaborate on that a little bit more later, but I did also just want to add that in addition to the experiences of grantees that we've studied over the past few years, we've also been looking at data about boards and have found that foundations that have boards with more racial diversity tended to adopt more practices to support grantees in the communities that they serve. And this we found a few years in a row in research that we did. Yet nearly half of the leaders that we interviewed for some of our research said that their boards are the biggest impediment to their foundation's ability to advance racial equity. And I can share more about our findings on board diversity and how that relates to changes in practices as well. I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you so much, Ellie. And I think it was good there actually to sort of think about where there are parallels between the US and the UK experience as well. You were talking about the pledge that funders put together to look at more unrestricted funding or reaching communities most impacted by injustice, particularly through the pandemic, but after the murder of George Floyd as well. And I think there are parallels with the UK with statements that funders signed up to here in terms of driving better funder practice. It feels difficult at times that it's a moment of real challenge, crisis, chaos, distress, and hurt that often leads to that kind of change. It'd be good to sort of unpick how we can build that in a more progressive way for the long term. But really good to get that sense of where you're at and what you see going on there, and how we can maybe start thinking about how that learning can be shared across the water. So thank you very much for sharing that with us to get us going, Ellie. I'm going to go to a few questions that try to draw out some of the themes that our panelists have said. As I said, we have also got the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to ask a question to any of our panel, or you want to raise a point that you'd like us to discuss and reflect on, do pop that in the Q&A box. And if you are not sure if you want to ask a question, but you want to have a look at what other people are asking, you should be able to see them in that box as well and give them the thumbs up or the thumbs down to help move them up the priority list, so we can make sure we focus in on the ones that you think are most relevant to your work and will be most helpful in terms of the learning that we're going to share. So do use that Q&A box for us. But I'll get going with just picking a few of the themes that you mentioned. And maybe Sufina and Marcella, I might come to you first, just in terms of that sort of origins of wealth and the historical context that we're working in. And there's been, I think, both the US and the UK, big debates, conversations about the need for funders to address the legacy of where money came from, the origins of wealth. But we also know the grant givers movement research in the UK found that 80% of UK grant makers couldn't identify the source of their income in terms of where that come from and what the issues might be attached to it. Sufina, I might come to you first if I can, just I know the John Ellerman Foundation did commission a research team to explore the origins of your endowment. Could you maybe just sort of tell us a bit more about that work and also why it was important to you to commission that?
Yeah, no, happy to. So we're quite an unusual foundation in that, well, we all say we're unusual and unique, don't we? I shouldn't have said that. No, so we started in 1971, and we have obviously our namesake, John Ellerman, in our title, but there are no kind of real living descendants. There's like a great niece who doesn't really remember him from his wife's side. But so there was an element of a few years ago, the board kind of recognizing those living links, either through family or the company from which the income was mainly derived. And it made them think, oh, maybe we should do like an oral history project and just try and capture some memories and reflections about our founder. And so it started off as that, and then at different points there's been talk about, should we kind of do a deeper dive rather than, oral history is brilliant, but a deeper dive into where does this money come from? Because a lot of the money was made by Sir John Ellerman II, his father, and that was earlier in the last century. And so last year we turned 50, and it's this idea that's kind of been bubbling around for a few years. But in light of the work that we were doing around diversity, equity and inclusion, and what was happening in the world, particularly because of the pandemic, but also the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. So I think there's a few kind of converging reasons that meant that we then thought that the best thing we could do is commission a research project, and we've ended up recruiting a team of 3 researchers to do a year-long, much deeper dive and interrogation of archives and history of the foundation. And we really have a very open mind to this. So, I think it started for a very kind of positive, clear reason. We just don't have living links. It's evolved somewhat. It's still that, but it's evolved somewhat now to recognize the fact that we do need to understand the origins of our wealth. And our thinking is that will then allow us to consider the ways in which our grant making and our investing and wider operations can be used to respond to whatever it is that we might find. And we really don't know. It's an interesting one, because in terms of where the money has come from, it's from the last century, and it relates to kind of shipping, breweries, business. But there will be more that we will uncover and learn, and we want to do so with transparency, and we want to share the findings, and we want to also share our response to the findings, rather than just kind of say, here you go, this is where our money comes from, full stop. We think that it will have to take a dialogue-based approach. But yeah, so all to play for. We're very much looking forward to hearing what the findings are, and we're keeping in touch with the research team, obviously.
Thanks, Sufina. And just taking that as one step further in terms of this being a festival of learning, if you were to sort of share any learning points on the journey you've been on so far with other funders who might be thinking about doing the same.
Yeah, so
work.
I would say just do it. I think that we can get kind of trapped in this be clear on why you're doing it. You should not be doing it for a tick box exercise. I think it helps us that we are genuinely interested. We are unusual in that we don't have, family members who can speak fondly of John and, tell us all of these kind of anecdotal and interesting points that, so there's an element of, we are interested in our past. We want to know who we were set up by, what made him tick, what he cared about, and to deal with the kind of contradictions, because, I'm sure his kind of 20th century views versus our 21st century views are going to be misaligned. and I'm sure there will be areas where they are aligned. And there are things that we do know, which are much more about kind of that public persona side of things. He was he was Britain's richest man, and so he was written about in papers. But we want to go a little bit deeper than that. I think so be really clear on your why. Be really, I think people should feel enthused. These are not things that we, are here to beat ourselves over the head with. These are things that only add to the strength and the richness of who you are. The more you know about yourselves, the more you can build who you are now and who you will be in the future. And also dismantle things which you're likely to need a lot of dismantling. So there's that. And then the how and the what, I just think it's just really important to just be curious and open. So we had a few kind of, at one point when I first joined, we commissioned someone, and because of the nature of the academia and researchers, she was then like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to go off and I've got to do a contract elsewhere. And all of a sudden I was like, well, coming back to that point I made at the beginning, if we're running the foundation with 3 kind of transparent, accountable, effective, why didn't I do an open recruitment process? Why did I, someone mentioned a researcher and I went and asked her to start doing some work, and then she got pulled away into doing something else. So another element is I think it is important to have that kind of openness to the research that you're doing personally. And also, there might be colleagues in the sector who are absolute experts in archival research and history and all of these things. I am not one of those people. So just, trying to make sure that if you're lacking confidence or expertise in what good commissioning of research looks like, just seeking out that advice, which we did. And we also have, we've got our internal kind of board and team and looking at all of this, but we have a project advisory group, which is just a couple of external people who are very much in the academic kind of history research world, and that just helps kind of strengthen the skill set that we don't have internally.
So thanks, Sufina. But again, really important points as a student of history. That sort of sense of knowing who you are now based on where you've come from is a really important part of anybody's journey, I think. So thank you for sharing that with us. Marcella, maybe I could come to you. I mean, Sufina was talking there about a 50-year organisation and wealth from the previous century. I appreciate Brooklyn Community Foundation itself is a bit younger, but you'll be working in a system that has wealth and money from a much more historical context as well. So how are those conversations in the US?
Yeah, so I don't know if anyone can see me, but I'm like nodding, and I'm very excited by everything Sufina is sharing, because we have been having similar conversations, and we'll have an upcoming project doing that same kind of digging. We are, let me say this. In capitalist societies, there's no way to amass this amount of wealth without extraction and exploitation and harm. Like this is what a capitalist system is constructed to like, this is how it works, right? So acknowledging that, the way, Sufina, the way you're talking about your foundation has done, just as a baseline, we need to understand where this wealth has come from. We have been having similar conversations. The foundation, as a community foundation, was established in 2009, but it was established and kind of like converted from a different foundation called the Independence Community Foundation. Independence Community Foundation, which was formed from Independence Community Bank, right? So the origins of our wealth come from a sale of a bank, and those assets were determined by the chair of the board at that time, the chairman of the bank, who then became the chairman of the board of the foundation. They carved out $65 or $75 million to create a foundation. And we have had internal conversations just on the staff level and some with the board just about, well, who was Independence Community Bank to Brooklyn? A lot of the bank's work was in loans and mortgages. And when we think about the social issues we address now in our work, a lot of it is based on and impacted by economic inequities, the impacts of gentrification, displacement of people, right? We can't separate ourselves as an institution from that history and pat ourselves on the back for the work we've done over the past, since 2009. I'm saying we don't get to because we're telling ourselves we don't get to. But in philanthropy, you do get to do that, right? In philanthropy, there really isn't much accountability. You can just come in with the power of wealth and say, I'm going to do good in this way, and I will be patted on the back for, this altruistic way of being, right? And that is problematic because just as that wealth has been amassed, oftentimes, and I think absolutely all the time, on the backs of people in communities, there has to be a built-in accountability if we're really talking about equity, if we're really talking about justice. So I'm really excited about the work Sufina's talking about. I am going to be reading up and following up to see how we can pull on some of those lessons. But that journey, I think, is a rare one. We're all at different stages of like internal reflections and really, whether it's being more transparent about your practices or even more transparent about your governance and who makes decisions in your foundation. We're all in a lot of different places, but I think it is a critical step in any foundation that whispers the word justice or equity. You have to be, first of all, accountable to how you got to be in a position of power just based on your association with this amassed wealth. How did that happen, and how do you rectify the harm that I'm sure was caused in the amassing of so many resources? So maybe you'll have us back next year and we'll have more to report on where we are in our journey, but that's definitely a part of our conversation. I think it's essential for any foundation doing this work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Marcella. You would be welcome back anytime. I think also we're really keen to look at where there are learnings that we can take between different places and how we can share that more actively. So this conversation is hopefully the start of some of those connections as well. And building on that, Ellie, if I come to you in terms of that, the overview and the sense you have, you talked about working with the network of funders you do in terms of being quite thoughtful about their work. And obviously there'll be a lot of conversations that are going on about origins of wealth, about how that the disconnect sometimes between, as Marcella says, what you're trying to achieve and where the money came from in the first place. And I have to say, I've been to some CEP events over the last couple of years, which were amazing and always really inspiring in terms of the nature of the conversation and the thoughts that people share with us. How are those conversations going at the moment from your perspective, and what learning might we take from them about how we tackle some of these issues about origins of wealth?
Yeah, it's been an interesting conversation to listen to. I haven't seen more data more broadly, so it's interesting as Sufina shared the study that they all were doing, and I did read that online too and found that very interesting, found the findings very interesting. The topic came up at a national conference that was being held by grantmakers for effective organizations yesterday as well, and I was listening in on that. One of the panelists was sharing that as foundations do learn this information, that perhaps it should be on their websites in the About section as they describe what their foundation is, who they are, which I thought was an interesting point. But we don't have data more broadly yet in terms of how foundations are thinking about this or what they're doing. And I'm sure as foundations move farther along in that journey, that would be a very interesting topic for us to study.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Ellie. And actually just a very practical example there of how we do encourage that transparency and accountability by something as what seems as simple as just putting it on the website, but that's quite a powerful thing in and of itself. So thank you for sharing that as an example. And I'll go to another theme that was coming up in what you were talking about, which is about the idea that representation itself is not necessarily enough to make racial justice happen, and it doesn't make grant making fair and just and equitable. And Sufina, I might come to you just while we've got you on the UK perspective, because obviously you were talking in your opening remarks about the Resourcing Racial Justice initiative that you're involved with. And there's the Festival of Learning blog that I think Melena popped a link to in the chat, where they were talking about widening representation and that not being enough within the system to bring about the change. From your perspective or your experience, what else do you think that funding organisations need to be doing to better support Black and minoritized communities longer term?
So I completely agree. It's not just enough to say, oh, you know, we've installed some people in and they look different to us and therefore all is well. And so I think there is an element of bringing people in and being really mindful of when you bring people in from minoritized backgrounds, that your culture is unlikely to be able to bring them in a way that is safe and effective. And so I think there's something about a lot of the conversation and focus tends to be on, so I'm going to answer this twofold: grant making, but also grant makers as organisations. You know, we focus in on recruitment, and I don't think we do enough about retention and progression. And I think we need to be thinking about it as all three. And progression doesn't need to be in your organisation. It could be onward progression to other organisations and how you build, you know, leaders of today, tomorrow, etc. I don't really know what would come after tomorrow. But anyway, today, tomorrow, I didn't need the etc. So I think there is something about what kind of organisation are you and how can you evolve so that you are more inclusive and celebratory and welcoming to people of all backgrounds. And that does require quite deep change. I think for it to be effective and happen, it cannot be one person's sole focus. It has to be the organisation is entirely bought into this. And even if it makes some of us uncomfortable or we're nervous or we're unsure, like, get the support you need. And I think a lot of the work, the labour, ends up on being people who are already carrying the most. And so there is a role, I think, for allies, and I think there is a role for people who perhaps have been, you know, are on the journey further along, just to talk more openly and share their experiences and their wisdom and their views and be in conversation as well as listening. It's not just about sharing. So I think there's something about grant makers. What can you be doing to make yourselves more welcoming? And so we have things like grant givers movement, and we have things like 10 years time. And so we have different ways, and we have Future Foundations UK, we have different groups and settings emerging to provide community. And I think that's what we need, because, you know, if you're in an organisation like mine and there's 6 of you and you're one person who's got to carry the burden of tokens and you might be at a lower level in the organisation, like, where is your community? Where do you get your safety and strength while the organisation is evolving to become more inclusive and welcoming of you? Then in terms of grant making, some of the things that Marcella mentioned, I think really resonate. So John Ellerman Foundation also gives unrestricted or call funding. I think that, you know, the way in which we understand the power that we hold, and whether, you know, I think we talk about fences, don't we? I'm not sure that funders, there's a fence and you've got funders on one side and the organisations you fund on the other side. I'd say that there are barriers and obviously power dynamics, but, you know, funders, we're committed to equity, justice and progress, some of us more so than others. And I think there's something about recognising, how do we move closer towards being in partnership with each other, recognising that we're not living it day in, day out, we're not breathing it in the way that our organisations that we fund are, but can we be a more supportive kind of partner to the organisations that we fund? And then I come back to it over and again, just understand your data, figure out where your baseline is. Are there kind of biases and ways of working that prevent people from applying to you? How can you undo those things? Are there also issues around, you know, if an organisation fails and it is from a quote unquote underrepresented group, do we say, okay, that's a one and done? Or do we then go, oh, remember that time when we funded that organisation? And I hate to say it, but that still happens. And unless we stop doing that, because, you know, you're one of that, I can give you 10 of non-underrepresented groups not working in the way that you wanted to, but no one seems to apply the same rule. So if we are insisting on the standards being higher for groups that are from underrepresented backgrounds, and we're not acknowledging that their resilience and the strain that they're placed under is so much higher, then we're going to have to make our standards for the kind of quote unquote more represented groups. Do you know what I mean? There's just an imbalance, I think, in the way, the expectations. And I think we need to demystify and also get rid of some of the kind of stereotypes and perceptions people have. Sorry, I feel like I'm like sermonizing or something. And I'm going to stop.
Never stop, Sufina. You can give a sermon anytime you like. It's always very important and very well received, and really important themes as well about it's not a one and done. It's not just a recruitment issue. It's not just a one grant issue. It's a structural, systemic thing. And Marcella, I might ask you to build on that sort of idea of not just recruitment, but also retention and progression. And if I can, I'll pick up a question that's come in on the Q&A box as well that links to this. Where one of our audience asked about what can funders do to better support emerging leaders from Black and minoritized communities. And this links a little bit, I think, to the point Sufina was making about particularly thinking about supporting them to grow their influence and their voice, whilst being mindful that a lot of existing leaders in this space are overstretched and exhausted. So maybe your reflections on what Sufina was saying, but also trying to bring in that emerging leaders point as well, if I can.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk a little bit to build on Sufina's comments. And again, I'm like nodding and making all sorts of noises in agreement as she's speaking, because I think a trend that we've seen in the US, and I don't know if you've seen this over on your side, over the past few years, grant makers have been very excited to recruit from like community organizing spaces and direct service nonprofits, and really bringing folks in who have more relevant experience to the types of impact that the foundations want to have in community. And what I've seen is that not all foundations, to Sufina's point, are really ready to bring those voices in and give them the space needed to really benefit from the expertise and the experience that they're bringing. And what I've seen at many organizations is short-lived tenures of those folks in the foundation space, and a lot of harm being caused with people being gaslit and people being, tokenized. And I think there's a lot of internal work that foundations need to do to prepare themselves to shift into a space to embracing those new voices that are desperately needed to do this work well. Some things that we've done at Brooklyn Community Foundation, and this speaks to how any kind of like racial justice working group work can't just be siloed and live with, whoever your HR person is, or just the president of the foundation or the programs person. But at our foundation, we have a racial justice working group, which is basically everybody. So everybody who works here is on one subgroup of our racial justice working group. And there's a group focused on like operations and internal practices. One of the projects they're wrapping up is a salary equity review, which is examined where there's difference based on identities and salaries and responsibilities, and making sure that there's a balance between what someone's title is and what their responsibilities are and what their compensation is. We, I think, are a foundation that is evolving out of a phase of, and a very common phase that a lot of foundations don't, being very kind of top heavy in white leadership. And then you see more people of color as you go to the positions that have less decision-making power and less compensation. We have seen a lot of change internally over the past few years. So like our board has a lot more people of color leading board committees. We have a Black woman as our president and CEO. So our senior team now looks different. And so the racial justice working groups, we have one focused on operations, one focused on culture. So like building affinity group spaces, we're about almost 20 people now. So while we encourage folks to tap into those spaces outside of our foundation that are, whether it's Asian American professionals in philanthropy, or AbbVie, or like some of the other organizations that are specific to racial groups that are doing grant making and development work, but also internally building those affinity spaces so people can have a safer environment to, step into those conversations about their experiences in the work and at the foundation. And then ongoing learning. So bringing in content that we can all grapple with together and have those difficult conversations. Another piece that we have outside of that has been so critical is we have a racial justice training team on retainer. They have provided coaching, individual coaching to our senior leaders, and we bring them in when we are in over our heads. So for example, we called them in after the murder of George Floyd. There was a lot of pain. We were working remotely. It was just hard to be with people. I think across the world, it was just hard to be with one another across racial lines. And there was a lot of pain and a lot of tension. And to have someone outside of your organization, but who knows you, who's trusted by you, who can come in and facilitate those difficult spaces has been incredible. That team does individual coaching with senior leadership. They've held facilitated conversations with staff. They do racial justice training with board members. They've done racial justice training with donor advised fund holders. I would send you their name, but they're very busy and I don't want to share. So, but no, they are fantastic. And I encourage foundations to really see like what are those assets you need around the foundation and around the institution to fortify the work, right? A lot of it happens internally, but you need other expertise to come to bear to support you on an ongoing basis. We've been engaged with them for years, and I think we'll continue to be. In terms of the question from the participant around support of emerging leaders from Black and people of color communities, that looks a couple of different ways for us. So one thing we've noticed again over the past several years is there's kind of this exodus of white leaders and white founders of organizations, and they're being, I think, in an effort to kind of share power and be responsible for really to the mission of their organizations and creating space for people who are kind of hold the identities of the folks that are supposed to benefit from the organization's work to be in leadership. They're kind of moving to the side, which is great. And you have Black and people of color leaders who may be coming into executive director or president roles for the first time, or just the challenges that exist with following a white founder are significant and they cannot be overlooked. So what we do as a foundation is we pay special attention to where that's the case. And we do things like we've provided like mini grants for transition support. So that might look like, having an executive coach that's a support person for that new leader so that they have a sounding board and guidance outside of their board, outside of their senior team. We do matching and kind of like relationship building with other leaders. So if, we have an organization now that has a new Black woman executive director. This is her first time being executive director. She's following a white founder. And so we are positioning her to be in relationship with other Black women executive directors, so that mentorship and that community can really be established, because the burnout, the isolation is very, very real. And I think the other thing that we do in terms of amplifying their voices is we prioritize them for donor meetings and for media spots. We have a very robust communications team. We do a lot of, articles, TV news, online stuff. And so we position those organizational leaders who are usually the ones at the back of the line, usually the ones whose leadership is questioned, or, foundations or other institutions take a wait and see approach. Let's back up, let's see how they do. No. We're putting them out front. We're giving them the support and really elevating them as leaders. And then listening to what they might need that we're not aware of yet. So those are some of the things that we've been doing. And we're a learning organization, so we learn and we see how it goes and we get more feedback and we try something new. So that's what we've got in our toolbox at the moment for those leaders.
Fantastic. Thanks, Marcella. And on the topic of learning, I'm going to use that as the segue, because we said Sufina would be with us for the first part of the conversation, then we'd focus in on the US experience. So Sufina, before we bid you a farewell for this session, maybe we could just ask you, either from what Marcella's just been saying there or anything that we've been talking about in this session, if you were to prompt us to have an action from today's discussion, what would you be telling us to do?
First of all, I do just want to say thank you. I'm so pleased to be in this space. It's so lovely to hear from Ellie and Marcella, and obviously James, you're guiding us through this discussion in such a good way. Kind of final reflections then, and thank you for letting me share them. I think it is just do the work, do it together. Don't make it one person's responsibility. Like, everyone has a stake in this, whether it, you know, directly, indirectly, previously, will do in the future. Like, this stuff impacts all of us, so you have to do it together. I think that there needs to be clear intention. It cannot be for the sake of, oh, we must because everyone else is. Like, it has to matter to you, and if it doesn't, do the work to get to a place of this mattering. I think it's easy for us to kind of say, well, you know, we've got a bit of momentum, let's keep going. But if people are left behind and they don't understand this work, they feel scared of it, whatever it might be, like, that will derail you going forward eventually, even if it's not in the short term. So you have to do the work and do it together, do it intentionally. I do think this is the time for us to be very bold. Enough will never be enough. There's, you know, the world is evolving, culture is changing. We need to work in ways that, you know, speaks to the now, but future-proofs ourselves as well. We don't know the kinds of inequities that are going to be emerging in the future. This is the time to start rebuilding and reimagining our kind of organizational cultures. And I do think that we need to do this work across all areas of an organization. It is not enough to do this just in your grant making. It has to be intentionally delivered across every aspect of your organization. So yeah, they're just a few final reflections. I know you said one, I've done several, but I want people to feel that this doesn't have to be burdensome. This is a key to transforming, evolving, and building your organization from what it is now to what it could be. We should all be really excited and energized by that. It does erode resilience, though. I completely hear what Marcella's saying. So that's me. So yeah, that's just, I would say, well, clearly I've got to stop talking now because they're doing the fire alarm test.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sufina. Hopefully you can get out in time to your muster point with a suitably high-vis jacket on. But thank you for joining us for this part of the conversation, Sufina. I never leave a coffee or a conversation with you without feeling inspired and motivated to go out and make some good change in the world. So thank you for joining us for this. And we will share the learning from the last part of the session with you later on as well. But for now, we'll say bid you a farewell. And we'll focus in on the US experience for this final part of the session, so the last 15 minutes. And again, if anyone's got any questions they want to ask to Marcella or to Ellie, do pop them in the Q&A box. But Ellie, if I can, I'm going to come to you just to continue that conversation about representation, about leadership, about roles within organisations, both in terms of any data you've got about leadership within the sector in the US, but also the overlooked reports that you've been involved in that looks at representation within foundations themselves, and just whether you're seeing funders in the US actively taking steps to diversify their workforce as well, either through the data or the research you've been doing.
Yeah, so I mean, anecdotally, we hear it being discussed at many large foundations in the US. I can't speak to the degree of action that's taking place, especially, you know, in 2022. But we do know from a 2021 report from the Council on Foundations, so they are a national membership organization in the United States. They conduct an annual survey about, among other topics, staff composition at foundations. And when we look at the last 5 years of their data, so from 2017 to 2021, there doesn't seem to be real change in the percent of foundation, for example, CEOs who are people of color. So in 2017, they reported about 11% of CEOs were people of color at foundations. And again, this is, you know, who chooses to respond to the survey, but was 11% in 2017. And in 2021, they reported about 12%. So really no movement there. In terms of full-time staff who are people of color, in 2017, they reported about 26%. In 2019, it was about 33%. And then in 2021, it dropped back down to about 29%. The one area where their data does show that there is potentially some changes in program officers. So in 2020, their statistic was about 35% of program officers were people of color. And in 2021, that went up about 5% to 40% of program officers. I'll also say that when it comes to boards, data that we at CEP have collected, at least in 2021, shows that so many foundation boards continue to lack racial diversity. So 27% of boards represented in the survey that we conducted had no board members of color. On 30% of boards, less than a quarter of members were people of color. And even as most of the foundation leaders that we interviewed said that their boards are having more and deeper discussions about systemic racism and its connection to their work, they did say that the most frequent impediment that they reported facing when trying to address systemic racism is their board. So there's some interesting statistics.
No, thank you, Ellie, and important ones as well. I think we see that similarly in the UK context. I think trust and foundations trustee board level, predominantly white. I think the ACF stats are like 99% of trustees of trust and foundations are white. In London, obviously, we're quite a diverse community. We also see in the public sector a different representation. You know, our councillors, our elected officials are much more closely aligned to the communities that they make decisions with and on behalf of. And just interesting where there are opportunities to learn and to grow and to check and challenge each other to do better on this. So thank you for sharing that experience. I'm going to bring up a theme that came out of some of the discussions we've had, but has also been a point that Yvonne would have raised if she was with us from Bailey, about the sort of funding surge. You know, you've talked about pledges, you've talked about awareness of issues, and that through COVID, people have had an awareness of funding going to the people who are most impacted. Murder of George Floyd, increased awareness of racial injustice and structural inequalities. And some of the concern that came through from UK organisations was that funding surge would be a short-term blip. You know, we're saying, oh, we suddenly realise we need to do something about this. We need to get some money out there. We'll get money to groups that are led by and for the communities that they serve. And concerns that won't necessarily be a long-term trend. And I guess maybe a question that Yvonne might have posed to us would be about where are the opportunities to learn? Where are the opportunities to do something that shows that we can make some of these progressive changes stick? This isn't just about a short-term investment. This is a recognition of a long-term structural problem that we need to address. And how do we make sure that investment path continues in a positive way? And Marcella, I might come to you first, if I can, just in terms of how you're seeing that play out in your community. Before Ellie, just any reflections from the data or the research that you're seeing at the wider level.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the issues that is really prevalent in philanthropy overall is just this like flavor of the month. What's the hot issue, whether it's racial justice right now or climate crisis. It is really dangerous and destabilizing to the work that's happening when there are these big fluctuations and swings by donors and foundations, kind of on a whim, or, you know, what they read in the Times, or, you know, what their friends are talking about. And I think it's really the responsibility of foundations and institutions and kind of donors who are activists to talk about the importance of long-term sustained support, right? And really being in relationship with the organizations and the individuals that you're funding, and not just having these transactional relationships, right? Like, I'm feeling compelled by this issue. I want to give a grant to this thing, and it goes to this organization, and I'm done, right? Like, I feel like I've addressed this emotion that's come up in me. That is, I think, a more traditional, really problematic approach to philanthropy. What we really need to see is more listening, more relationship building, and more long-term commitment. And even once you for example, racial justice is now, or racial disparities and racial inequities are becoming more talked about, I think slightly better understood. And so this desire to somehow integrate that into your programming or your approach, one, maybe coming from this, light bulb that's gone off, but two, a lot of it is, we don't want to look like we're not doing the right thing. We don't want to be left behind. We don't want to seem unaware by our donors and our supporters. So we need to make this statement and we need to do something. That's really dangerous. A way that you can infuse that into your grant making is to have an intersectional lens on whatever issue you're currently working on, right? So if you're working on environmental issues, there's absolutely a racial lens you can put on that to make sure that as you work towards, whether it's preserving coastal land in Brooklyn to make sure that, the next hurricane that hits New York doesn't flood the neighborhood that's next to the coast, there's a way to have that conversation and invest in that with an understanding of the difference in experience and impact across racial lines in that community. You just have to be willing to have that conversation and bring in folks who are already, everyone's talking about something, right? There are people doing that work right now. You have to, one, recognize that they're experts and trust in their expertise and bring them to the table or ask to be invited to their table to be a partner with them, and then do the work of establishing that relationship to work on that issue. You don't have to make a kind of this dramatic swing away from something to something else. You can just have a refined approach to the work that you're already doing. Typically, there's space for that if organizations and foundations are willing to take a new kind of view and approach to the work that they're already doing. But I think it's really dangerous to make these sweeping commitments just to look like you're doing the right thing. And I don't know if Ellie's going to mention this, but the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity did a report and released it, I think, late last year, tracking these commitments, these commitments to fund racial justice from grant makers, from corporations and different companies, and try to see, did that money actually move? Were those commitments actually fulfilled? And it doesn't look great, right? So I think we need to do better, like self-accountability as institutions, and also, like Pri was doing with that report, accountability throughout the sector to make sure that these commitments aren't doing more harm than good.
So thank you, Marcella. And Ellie, you might want to pick up on that theme, but also I think there's the overlooked series. I know you picked up on data from Asian American community about funders reaching out amid heightened media attention of anti-Asian incidents and asking for sort of innovative ideas to tackle some of these solutions, rather than recognizing that sort of deep, substantial work that's been happening in communities.
Can I say one other thing about that, James?
Of course you can.
That comes to mind as you make the comment about funders reaching out to, in this case, Asian American and Pacific Islander leaders and organizations. The other dangerous thing and really harmful thing that funders do is, their interest is piqued by something, they call the person they know and they ask, what new and innovative thing are you doing to address this issue? Right? Not what sustained work have you been doing that's been like making progress on this that you need support. We don't want to fund that. What's the new shiny thing we can put our name on? That is very, very dangerous. And what we see happens, and we're not a huge funder, but we try to use the might that we do have to push other foundations in the right direction, because what nonprofits will do and feel pressured to do is come up with the new shiny thing because they need the resources, right? So grant makers and funders really have to be careful about how they enter those conversations and be willing and really focus on, how do you support sustained work, right? Like, how do you support that core work to make sure those organizations are even in a position where they can respond when emergencies hit their communities? That came to mind because that's a call that a lot of leaders get, and it's really frustrating.
Yeah, understood. I think we face it here as well, with that sense that there's a crisis, we need to do something to build community resilience. But that's the work of decades to build community resilience. It's not an overnight blip thing. So no, very, very much agree with you, Marcella. Ellie, in terms of your reflections on that issue, that surge for sort of shiny things versus the long-term substantial deep work that needs to happen in communities.
Yeah, I mean, I would just build on what Marcella said, and some of the Asian American Pacific Islander leaders we interviewed said just that, exactly what Marcella said about the decades of work that their organizations had been doing on these issues, and then some sudden interest in, well, what are you going to do differently about it, or what would be interesting to us about that? So, and I would just say, and what we learned from that research went beyond the funding. So, for example, fewer leaders of Asian American and Pacific Islander, of nonprofits that serve Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, said that foundations help to elevate the voice of their organizations during the pandemic at a time where they really had messages that they wanted to be able to get out there and have promoted. So things like, they reported fewer foundations hosted webinars that featured their voices or voices from their communities compared to leaders of other communities. And it's especially concerning when you look at some of the health statistics from the Asian American Pacific Islander communities during that time, as well as the hate crimes, that were taking place. So it wasn't just the funding, it was all sorts of ways. I think even if funding came in, the voices still weren't being elevated and the stories weren't being told. And in terms of the kind of continuation, right, of some of these changes in funding, and I think, I'll be very interested as well to see what comes of the pre-analyses as they follow some of these funding streams. We have similar skepticism, and we mentioned this in our reports, of what will continue. I don't want to say after the pandemic, because I don't know when after the pandemic will be, but what will continue beyond this time. So in our research, we had about 60% of foundation leaders say that their foundations made changes to how they even identify prospective grantees, and 70% said they made changes to how they select grantees. And they talked about things like exploring their own biases, which Sufina mentioned earlier, reducing barriers to access to their funding, like publicizing the grant opportunities in different ways. And among those foundations that said they made these kinds of changes, more than 80% said in the research that they would sustain them. And that's a very high number. And I think that remains to be seen, whether or not those are sustained, and what the changes are moving forward.
Thank you, Ellie. And obviously we hope they do get sustained, but there's work to be done to make it so. And maybe Marcella, if I could ask you from the sort of position of a funder, we at London Funders are going through our own sort of strategy review and thinking about how we best support funders and community groups in London for the longer term. For organisations like Centre for Effective Philanthropy, what role do people like us have to play in the system in supporting funders and community groups in that mission to improve support for Black and minoritized communities? What can we be doing to be a better partner?
Yeah, I think having conversations like this is really important. I think organizations and foundations that are trying, we experiment with a lot of things, and we need to talk about it as we're doing it, as we're learning. We have a board, and to Ellie's earlier point about boards sometimes being an impediment to advancing work in this area, we're really fortunate. We have a really supportive board that leans into the expertise of the staff. And something I know about foundation boards is that they often want to see what other foundations are doing so that they're not left behind. So for us, it's important for us to talk about our approach, to talk about what's working, to talk about how we really live into our values, and offer to be used that as an example for our colleagues to go to their board and say, hey, look what Brooklyn Community Foundation is doing. We could and should be doing this too. And there have been instances where I've done the same, to say like, hey, look what New York Foundation is doing. We need to improve in this area. And I think it's a healthy encouragement that can happen across foundations, where you have those relationships across staff, right? Like I find a lot of support, both being able to be offered for myself and gain from my colleagues in these collaborative spaces where you have values aligned funders who are coming together to grapple with like where they're challenged or how they're working through something. We have a collaborative here in New York City that we come together around capacity building offerings and issues. And that space is really a professional development space for grant making professionals. And we use it as such. We do programming for capacity building, but what we gain as individuals is really critical to the success of our individual work and our foundations. So I think engaging in spaces like that is really important, where you can publish the work of your foundation if you're doing like a concrete project, or even to give updates on a process. Getting the work out there is just really important.
Fantastic. Marcella, you've basically written my new strategy for me, so I will have to get a check in the post over to Brooklyn for you. But really important points there about how you bring sort of values aligned funders together and how you create those opportunities for showcasing and amplifying. So if words like that do appear in the London Funder strategy, I will footnote you.
Go for it, James. You can have all of it.
You're very, very kind. Thank you. In that spirit of generosity, you've been fantastic at sharing your learning with us. We've got a lot of people who've been listening in, and a lot more that we're going to be sharing this with afterwards. If we were to ask you as a final question, just give us a sense of what action you think we ought to be taking as a result of discussions like this, or which bit of learning we need to be really building on for the future, so that we can really strengthen our work in this space. If I was to give you a sort of final thought space, what would you be telling us to go away with ringing in our ears? And Ellie, if I come to you first on that one, and then Marcella.
Sure. I mean, I agree with everything that Sufina had said before, so would just want to kind of support all of her final thoughts there. And I would add that I think in our data, in our research these past couple of years, foundations have been able to make incredible amounts of change in the work that they do, including even the provision of unrestricted support, which for decades in philanthropy had remained stagnant, and during the pandemic changed. And so I think that gives me hope that foundations, in a sector that is often slow to change, and where there's a lot of bureaucracy, can in fact change, and change quickly when they want to, and when they feel the need is there. And so I would say, especially when it comes to racial equity and racial justice, we see a lot of foundations either having started this journey in the past couple of years, or have moved farther along on it. And that, I think there's a lot of hope there that they will continue with this, but would just underscore the importance of not losing the momentum that's been built these past couple of years, and not losing the motivation, back to Sufina's point of remembering why. Why do foundations need to be making these changes? It is so that they can become effective, and more effective foundations than they had been previously.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ellie. And Marcella, final thoughts from you.
I'm also gonna say ditto to everything Sufina said. I thought all of her points were right on where they need to be. I'm gonna give a bit of advice and a call to action for folks who work in foundations, who get excited by these conversations, who have read all the articles about what it looks like to do racial justice or equity work within institutions. And what I will tell them is to be strategic, to enlist their senior team. It doesn't have to be the whole team. Find someone on that senior team to be a champion that you can push these ideas to, and you all can get excited about it together. If you can, enlist your CEO and figure out who is that, or who are those board members. It might just be one, but how do you activate that board member or that group of board members to push some of these things forward? Because where a lot of folks get stuck, and I think this leads to good people leaving foundations because they feel like there isn't enough movement, is they get excited by these conversations and these new ideas, but there isn't space to move within their institution. So how do you create that space? You have to be that igniter. You have to get people excited and enlist them into this cause. And how do you do that? Figure out where the decision-making power is, right? Where is there already an opening? Where's their decision-making power? And how can you spark a fire under that to start to move things forward? That's what I'll say. I've done it with colleagues at Brooklyn Community Foundation. It's been very effective. And I know it works. It can work other places. So that would be my encouragement.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marcella. Let's keep those fires burning, and let's make some good change happen. So thank you very much for that. Marcella, Ellie and Sufina in her absence, you have been an incredible panel to help us close the online part of the Festival of Learning. And I think so much of what you've both said chimed with what Sufina shared and what we're seeing at London Funders as well. I think some of the big issues that we've been grappling with as societies are not dissimilar. You know, they've been magnified by COVID, they've been magnified by the murder of George Floyd, but these are issues that are fundamental to how we reshape and reform our societies to be more just, to be more equitable, and to be better for the future. And I think the pandemic's also shown us that we can have these kind of conversations quite easily over Zoom once we've worked out what time it is in different places. And those connections are starting or are growing in many cases, and we're really keen to keep them alive and to keep them strong for the future. And I think there's lots of what you've said. We're really keen to hear about how your journeys progress on this, and I know there's things that Sufina shared or that we're going through with London Funders and our wider membership that we'll be really keen to share with you. So we will definitely be inviting you back for future sessions, but I'll be really encouraging us trying to keep these dialogues going for the future as well. So huge thanks to you for sharing your time, your expertise, your insights, your inspiration with us this afternoon. It's been fantastic to have you with us, and it's been fantastic to have all of you in the audience as well listening to this and hopefully taking away those actions and making some positive change for our communities. If you do want to continue that conversation, I have the absolute joy of telling you that we have Fringe Fridays tomorrow. London Funders being well trendy, we have at the festival, we have in-person meetings tomorrow in Hyde Park and Ladywell Fields. So if you want to come along, Marcella and Ellie, we can't quite stretch to an airfare, but you'll be with us in person. But those of you who are in London, if you want to come along to Hyde Park or Ladywell Fields, we'll get you a coffee, a cake, an ice cream if it's sunny, and we'll continue some of these conversations about how we can build on this learning for the future. So Melena's putting the link in the chat if you want to come along in person to any of the Fringe Friday sessions tomorrow. But this closes the sort of online part of the festival, and I can't imagine a better way to have done it without more powerful contributions, without more inspiring insights about how we can do stuff for the future. So another final thanks to you, Marcella, and to Ellie for joining us, and to Sufina as well. We'll pass on thanks as well. And thanks to all of you. Hopefully you're going to go away and take all that action. We're going to make the world a better place. And next year when we come back to talk about this, we'll have some really positive examples to share to continue this conversation. So thank you for now, and we'll see you all soon.